The morning officer Brett Gallagher stood at the witness stand, tugged his left shirt cuff with that small, unconscious pull she had catalogued 14 times in 14 months. Pointed his thick finger directly at the woman sitting quietly in the third row of the gallery, and told Judge Diana Forsyth that she was a known criminal associate who had been conducting illegal surveillance on his officers and had personally threatened him that morning. Special Agent Raina Carter of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face absolutely still, and she did not move because the recording of Brett Gallagher's voice, time-stamped and authenticated and filed in a federal vault in Washington, D.C., had been sitting there for 6 weeks already, and everything he was saying in open court was simply adding numbers to a list that already had 16 items on it. She had been waiting for this exact moment for 14 months and 3 days. But you need to understand how it started, because none of it begins in that courtroom. It begins on a gray Friday morning in October on a street called Kramer, with a U-Haul van and a cover story about a paralegal job and an apartment that smelled like fresh paint laid over old cigarettes with a radiator that banged against the pipes at 2 in the morning like a drunk who couldn't find the right door. Raina Carter moved in alone, the way a woman who had learned to be self-sufficient in every environment moves into a place she is not planning to love efficiently without sentiment, with one eye already on the angles of the room. She carried her own boxes up 3 flights of stairs and did not ask for help, and by the time the light was going amber through the window that faced Kramer Street, she had the furniture arranged. The camera mounted inside the fake smoke detector on the sill, her real phone and her badge locked in the case under the bathroom floorboard, and the photograph of her father standing on the windowsill where she could see it from the kitchen table. That photograph was the one true thing in the apartment, and she needed it there. Her neighbors were a woman named Mrs. Audrey Phelps, who was 67 and grew herbs on her fire escape in hand-labeled terracotta pots, and left her door slightly open when she cooked. So the smell of something good drifted down the hallway, and a young couple named Jerome and Destiny 2 doors down who argued about money in loud, specific voices, and then made up with equal volume and frequency, and whose presence made the building feel lived in and real in a way that made Raina's cover easier to wear. She learned the corner store where Mr. Okafor kept the radio on a jazz station, and knew everyone's order before they reached the counter. She learned which streets Gallagher patrolled and what hours he worked and which corners he lingered at, because she had been reading about Brett Gallagher for 3 weeks before she moved in, and she understood his geography already. She just needed to become invisible inside it. She grew up in West Baltimore on a street 30 blocks from this one in a row house where her father worked the night shift at the port and her mother worked the day shift at the hospital, and she knew what it meant to watch a police cruiser slow down beside you when you were just walking home from school, and she knew what it meant to be looked at and already convicted in someone's mind before you had done a single thing except exist in the wrong body, in the wrong zip code. That knowledge did not make her hate the law. It made her need to be inside it, where the gears were, where the weight got applied because someone needed to be in there turning those gears in the right direction. She went to Howard for law school and then spent 2 years as an assistant public defender and watched the machine grind the wrong people into dust with a thoroughness that felt almost industrial. And then she joined the FBI at 26 because she still believed she needed to believe that the machinery of justice could be turned right side up by someone willing to stay inside it long enough to find the lever and pull. She jogged past Gallagher's cruiser in the mornings. She nodded when he was watching. She was invisible the way a black woman alone in a neighborhood like Millhaven was invisible to men like him, present and dismissed, noticed and not seen. And she understood that invisibility the way she understood most things about Brett Gallagher. It was a tool, and she intended to use it until she was done. 3 weeks before she carried those boxes up the stairs on Kramer Street, Raina sat in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Baltimore field office and watched her supervisor, Assistant Special Agent in Charge Dana Reyes, slide a manila folder across the table with the flat, unhurried motion of a woman who had been doing this for 19 years and understood that the weight of what was inside a folder was not something you needed to announce. "We think he's dirty," Dana said, settling back in her chair and folding her hands. "We think he's been dirty for 3 years. We have community complaints going back to his 3rd year on the force. We have 3 dismissed civil suits, each one closed before discovery, each one involving a Black or Latino complainant who ran out of money or patience or both before they could push it to trial. We have 1 open internal affairs investigation that has been sitting on someone's desk for 11 months without a single interview being conducted, which tells you everything you need to know about who is sitting on it." Raina opened the folder. Officer Brett Gallagher, badge number 3, 892, 11-year veteran of the Millhaven precinct. The photograph showed a square jaw and close-cropped, dirty blonde hair, and the comfortable, settled expression of a man who had been wearing a uniform long enough that it had become his actual skin. His 2021 performance review. She read it carefully, the way she read everything the first time, slowly and without skipping, contained a line that she would think about many times in the following 14 months. "The badge is the last honest thing left in this neighborhood. Everything else is negotiable." It was written in his own hand in the comments section, and whoever had reviewed it had not flagged it, which told her something about the culture she was walking into. The IIA complaints were a pattern so consistent it had the quality of a signature. Unlawful stop and search, excessive force, planting of narcotics, intimidation of witnesses after complaints were filed, every complainant, Black or Latino, every neighborhood too tired and too underfunded to keep pushing. Every complaint closed without action, the files thin and the follow-up absent in a way that suggested the closure was a decision made at a level above the officer who caught the call. "What am I going in as?" Raina asked. "Yourself," Dana said. "Resident. New to the neighborhood. You rent an apartment on Kramer Street. You live there, you become part of the community. We need you close enough to watch how he works his beat because watching from outside is how we got 3 dismissed civil suits and a dead investigation. We need someone inside the radius. What's the end state?" Dana looked at her steadily. "All of them. Not just Gallagher. He doesn't operate in a vacuum, nobody like him does. There's someone signing the paperwork and someone clearing the arrests and someone above that who has been keeping the lid on the IIA file. I want the whole chain." A brief pause. "We think it goes up to Captain Frank Odom. We can't prove it yet." Raina closed the folder and looked at the photograph of Gallagher one more time. The easy confidence, the settled posture, the performance review, comment written in a hand that did not understand it, was writing its own indictment, and she thought about the 20 miles between this conference room and the street she grew up on, and the way those 20 miles were and were not a distance at all. "I know what this neighborhood looks like," she said. "I know you do," Dana said. "That's partly why you're going." Raina picked up the folder. She already knew what she was going to find inside Millhaven because she had grown up adjacent to a place just like it, and she understood that the thing Brett Gallagher was doing to that community was not new and was not accidental. It was a pattern as old as the badge itself, and it had kept going for 11 years because nobody with the right tools had ever been close enough to document it the right way. She was about to be close enough. It was a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of the assignment, and Raina was coming back from the laundromat 2 blocks over, carrying her blue mesh laundry bag with the clothes still warm inside, and her mind running through the patrol log she had been building on Gallagher's routes when the cruiser pulled up alongside her on the sidewalk and rolled at walking pace beside her without stopping. She kept walking. She noticed things in the first 2 seconds, the way she had trained herself to notice things. The cruiser was his badge number, 3892, on the door panel. The interior dark with the last of the evening light. And through the passenger window she could see his profile and the motion he made before he reached for the window button. A small, sharp tug at his left shirt cuff, so quick and so unconscious that a person not specifically watching for tells would have missed it entirely. Raina noted it, filed it, and continued walking. The window rolled down. "Hey," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was the opening move of a game she had seen played before, and the specific flatness of it, not hostile, yet not friendly. Just testing the surface to see what kind of sound it made, told her that he had already filed her under a category and was checking whether she would confirm it. She looked over. Let her expression be open and a little tired, the way a woman looks at the end of a long working day when she is carrying warm laundry and wanting nothing more complicated than her own couch. "Evening," she said. "Neutral. Not too friendly, not guarded. Just present. You new around here?" He was studying her with that particular police stillness, the practiced economy of a man who had trained himself to read threat levels in fractions of a second and sort people into columns, the compliant, the loud, the dangerous, the dismissible. And she understood that she was being sorted right now, and that the category he was building for her had nothing to do with anything she had actually done and everything to do with what she looked like standing on this particular block at this particular hour. "Few weeks?" she said. She let the laundry bag rest against her hip, relaxed. He looked at her for a moment that stretched past comfortable, his eyes doing that quick top-to-bottom scan that she recognized as the assessment of a man who had made a career out of reading people and had long since stopped questioning what the reading told him. "Stay out of trouble," he said, and rolled the window up, and the cruiser continued down the block. Raina watched it go, keeping her face neutral until it turned the corner, and then she continued up the sidewalk and into the building and up the 3 flights of stairs to her apartment, where she set the laundry bag on the kitchen table, took out her field log, and wrote down the time and the exact words and the cuff tug she had clocked before he opened the window, because in her experience the small, unconscious things a man did before he performed authority were more revealing than anything he said out loud. The mesh bag was heavier than its contents suggested, because built into the false panel in the bottom lining was a voice-activated recorder the size of a pack of gum standard equipment for this kind of work, and it had captured every word he said. 4 words. Almost nothing and everything about how his mind worked. She had already cultivated the 3 sources she would rely on most heavily in the weeks ahead. Mr. Earl Pritchard, 65 years old, who had lived on Kramer Street for 4 decades and kept a handwritten journal that currently ran to 41 pages, documenting every interaction he and his neighbors had ever had with Officer Gallagher, a man who had never stopped believing that what he witnessed mattered even when no one was reading. Benny Tillman, who ran the auto shop on Turner Avenue and had the specific instincts of a man who had once been on the wrong side of the law and understood exactly how it worked. And Priya Ose, a social worker who had been stitching up the community's wounds for 7 years and could map Gallagher's damage in the faces of the people she served. Raina filed the 4 words, put the recorder back in its panel, and went to the window and watched the street below until the last light was gone. Over the 2 months that followed, Raina watched Brett Gallagher work. And she means that literally she had the camera in the smoke detector facing Kramer Street. She had the recorder in the laundry bag and in her jacket lining on the days she was in his range. She had Marcus Webb at the monitoring station 2 miles away with his headphones on and his coffee going cold. and she had Mr. Pritchard's journal gaining pages at a steady, careful pace. And together these things built a picture of a machine so routine in its cruelty that the cruelty itself had become invisible to the man running it. Gallagher was methodical and he was intelligent, which made him more dangerous than a cop who was simply aggressive, because an aggressive cop makes mistakes out of heat, and a methodical cop has learned to manufacture just enough pretext to survive the paperwork. He pulled young men over on pretexts so thin they barely deserved the word "a turn signal" used half a second early. A taillight with a crack he could have photographed from 3 different angles depending on what the stop needed to become. An expression on a young man's face that Gallagher decided he didn't like the look of and wrote up as furtive behavior. If the stop yielded nothing, sometimes he made sure it yielded something, and he had been doing it long enough that the motion was fluid and quick, and almost impossible to separate from a legitimate discovery unless you were watching from the right angle with the right equipment. The first time Raina saw it with her own eyes, she was across the street from a stop involving a 19-year-old named Darius, who had his hands on the roof of his own car with the specific hunched compliance of a young black man who has learned that compliance is the only margin between a stop and something worse. She watched Gallagher circle the car, watched him come around to the wheel. Watched him reach into his own jacket pocket before reaching toward the car and come out with a small package that he held up the way a man holds up something he has found rather than something he has placed. She watched it, and her body went cold and completely still, and she thought with the cold clarity of 8 years of training, "I saw it." But seeing it and proving it are 2 different things entirely, and proof is what the Bureau needs, because without proof it is my word against 11 years and a commendation and a union lawyer. The paperwork chain became clear to her in the 3rd week, after every stop, whether it yielded a legitimate arrest or one that Gallagher had manufactured. Officer Carl Briggs would file the reports, a 29-year-old 2 years on the force, with the hollow, slightly unfocused look of a man who had asked questions once and understood from the answer that asking again would cost him more than staying quiet. Briggs signed what he was told to sign. He wrote it up clean. And then Sergeant Doug Mercer, 52 years old, heavy in the shoulders, the kind of cop who had been institutional furniture for so long he had stopped distinguishing between the department's interests and his own, would clear the arrest without review his signature. A rubber stamp so consistent that when Raina cross-referenced his sign-offs against Gallagher's arrest record, she found 41 consecutive clearances without a single query, which was not the behavior of a supervisor doing his job, and was instead the behavior of a man who understood that his job was to make the paperwork disappear. Above Mercer was Captain Frank Odom, 58 years old, who had been in that office for 9 years and had shut down 3 separate internal affairs investigations in 3 years, each one involving Gallagher, each one closed within 48 hours of opening. The poker game with Deputy Commissioner Raymond Holt every other Friday was documented in a surveillance log Raina had subpoenaed from a city security feed. A standing arrangement, the same house, the same evening, the kind of routine that spoke to a relationship built on shared interests running deeper than cards. It was when Raina read Earl Pritchard's journal for the first time, all 41 pages of it, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon with the November rain against the window, that she understood the full weight of what she was inside. Pritchard had been writing in that journal for 11 years since Gallagher was first assigned to the Millhaven beat, and the entries were careful and specific and quietly devastating, full of names and dates and descriptions of young men she would never meet, and older men who had stopped going out after dark, and women who had taught their children different routes home. He had never stopped writing it, even when it seemed to go nowhere, even when the complaint forms came back, stamped closed. 40 years on this street, 40 years of watching, and he had kept the record because he believed with a stubbornness that moved something deep in Raina's chest when she read it, that witnessed things mattered, even when no one was yet reading the witness. She would make sure someone read it. She made that decision quietly on a Sunday afternoon in November, and she kept it. It was a Sunday in January, gray and bone cold in the specific way that January gets in Millhaven, where the cold comes off the river and settles into the streets and stays there until March, and the light was flat and thin and made everything look like it had been drained of color. Raina was at the window with the camera transmitting and a book open in her lap that she was not reading because she had been watching the corner of Kramer and Fifth for 20 minutes with the particular alertness of someone who has been doing this long enough to develop a feel for when something is about to happen. Calvin Morrow was 46 years old, and he was walking home from First Baptist where he was a deacon in his good coat, a charcoal gray wool coat, well pressed with the quiet dignity of a man who treated Sunday as Sunday, who understood that how you presented yourself to the world on the Lord's Day was a statement about what you believed the world owed you in return. He worked logistics at a warehouse 5 days a week. He had a daughter named Tanya who was 8 years old and who he coached on Saturday mornings in the youth basketball league at the community center on Fulton Street. He had never been arrested in his life. His record was clean in the way that a record is clean when a man has spent 46 years being careful and honest and exactly as visible as he needed to be and no more. Gallagher's cruiser turned onto Kramer Street at 2:17 in the afternoon, and Raina watched it slow as it reached the corner of Fifth, and she watched Gallagher look at Calvin through the windshield with the flat assessment she had memorized over 2 months. And she reached without looking toward the transmitter on the windowsill and confirmed it was active and transmitting to Marcus 2 miles away. The cruiser stopped. Gallagher got out. He had a reason. He always had a reason that was part of what made him difficult to catch, and the reason today was a vague gesture toward Calvin's coat pocket. A claim Raina could not yet hear from the window, but that she could read in the way Gallagher's body positioned itself, authoritative. Space claiming already certain of the outcome before the conversation had begun. Calvin stopped and turned, and his hands came up immediately in the way of a man who has been through enough of these encounters to understand that hands visible is the first and most important rule. He was calm. He was cooperative. He was, Raina thought, exactly the kind of person this machine had been designed to process, because his calmness and his cooperation were not protection, they never had been. Briggs pulled up in the second cruiser, 2 minutes in, and Raina watched through the camera as Gallagher positioned Calvin against the wall of the building, with his palms flat against the brick and his good Sunday coat stretched tight across his shoulders. She watched Gallagher pat him down, thorough, unhurried, the performance of a man doing a search that he already knows the conclusion of. And then she saw it. Before Gallagher's right hand moved toward Calvin's coat, his left hand went to the interior pocket of his own jacket, and she watched the transfer so quick and so practiced that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. And then Gallagher's right hand produced a small sealed bag from Calvin's coat pocket, with the satisfied air of a man who has found exactly what he expected to find. Gallagher tugged his left cuff once sharp before he held the bag up for Briggs to see. Marcus called her 40 seconds later. His voice was very level. "Tell me you got that." "Every frame," she said. Her voice was level too. Her hands were pressing flat on the window frame hard enough that the paint was leaving marks in her palms. Calvin's face in the camera was good enough that she could see it clearly wore the expression she had seen described in Mr. Pritchard's journal, and had never fully understood until this moment the specific, bewildered expression of a man who has just been told that something is true that he knows with absolute certainty is not true, and who cannot understand why no one around him is questioning it. Gallagher said something to Briggs, and the microphone mounted in the bushes across the street picked it up clearly, and those words went directly into the federal vault 2 miles away. "Write it up clean. Nobody checks the paperwork when the name is already familiar." Raina heard it through her earpiece and wrote the exact words in her field log with the time and the date, because those words had just become the opening line of an indictment. She told Marcus not yet. She wanted the whole machine, Mercer, Odom, all of them. She called public defender Vanessa Cole from the bathroom cover phone window open so the sound of the street covered her voice. Vanessa was 32 years old and had been fighting Millhaven cases for 4 years, with the relentless, slightly exhausted energy of a person who keeps fighting, not because winning is guaranteed, but because stopping would be its own kind of loss. Raina told her she was a community advocate who had witnessed the stop and believed the arrest was fabricated. Vanessa asked 2 sharp questions. How close were you? And did you see his hands, and decided from the specificity of the answers that she believed her. She went to the precinct that night. Calvin Morrow was going to be processed and arraigned, and his trial was going to be scheduled, and for the next 3 months, Vanessa was going to fight for him in the dark. Not knowing that the only person who had actually seen what happened on the corner of Kramer and 5th was standing in an apartment 3 blocks away with her badge under the floorboard and a transmitter in her laundry bag, waiting for the machine to expose enough of itself to bring the whole thing down at once. Midnight, and Raina was still at the kitchen table with the tea she had made 2 hours ago, sitting cold in the mug beside her open laptop, doing something she probably wasn't supposed to do, which was pull up Calvin Morrow's public record on her personal screen rather than filing it properly through the Bureau's system, because after watching a man get his life dismantled in 45 seconds on a Sunday afternoon in his best coat, she needed to know who he actually was. Not as a case number, not as a witness for a future prosecution, but as a person whose specific life she had just watched get picked up and shaken by a man who did not know him and did not care to. His record was clean. She knew that already, but seeing it laid out was different from knowing it. Born in Millhaven, never left. 1 parking ticket in 2017 paid the same week. Employed at Eastside Logistics for 9 years, good standing. His daughter was Tanya, 8 years old, enrolled at Franklin Elementary in the 2nd grade. He coached the under-10 youth basketball league at the Fulton Street Community Center on Saturday mornings. She could find the league's website, which listed the coaches, and his name was there with a small photograph of him in a green t-shirt, laughing with 3 small kids around him who were too young to know they were supposed to be taking the photograph seriously. He sang in the choir at First Baptist. He was a deacon. His mother lived 4 blocks from his apartment, and he visited her on Wednesdays. Raina looked at this information for a long time, and she felt something in her chest shift in a way that she had learned over 8 years in this work to identify and contain, but had never quite learned to prevent the old specific anger of a girl from West Baltimore who had grown up watching this happen, who had watched men exactly like Calvin Morrow get processed through a machine that was designed to produce a particular kind of outcome, regardless of what the truth was and who had joined the FBI, precisely because she believed that if someone like her got inside that machine and stayed there long enough, she could change the direction it ground in. The 3-layer weight of the moment settled on her all at once, the physical reality of her hands pressing flat on the table, the cold kitchen, the tea gone cold, the smallness of the apartment around her, the internal reckoning of the old anger rising up through the professional casing she had built over it over 8 years. And beneath both of those, the specific image from her own childhood she had been carrying for 25 years. Her father standing at the hood of his car on the walk home from the port on a Tuesday night in October. Hands flat on the metal, a cruiser's lights reflecting off the wet pavement, and the way he had looked when he came inside afterward, not broken because he was not a man who broke, but diminished in some quiet, specific way that did not have a name and did not go away. She did not cry. She went to the window and stood there for a long time, looking out at the empty street 3 floors below, at the pools of orange streetlight on the wet pavement, at the dark storefronts and the bare November trees. And she made a quiet, specific promise to a man she had never met and who did not know she existed. She was going to get them all. Not just Gallagher, who had done the act. Mercer, who had signed the paperwork. Odom, who had cleared the investigations and kept the lid on and made sure the operation kept running. Every hand that had touched this and made it possible. She was going to pull the thread all the way to the end, and she was not going to stop when it got difficult, and she was not going to let the size of what she was trying to do make her flinch. She went to bed at 1:30 a.m. and was asleep in 10 minutes, which was something she had learned to do in the field sleep when you can, because the nights when you can't are coming and you need to be ready for them. The case had changed shape tonight. It was no longer about evidence in the narrow sense. Evidence was what the Bureau needed, and she was building it. But the shape underneath the evidence was something older and more personal. And she understood that carrying it was going to cost her something before the end. And she had decided that was acceptable because the debt being paid on the other side of it was larger. The 3 months after Calvin Morrow's arrest were the months when the architecture of the case became clear to Raina in its full dimensions. And when it did, it was bigger than she had initially mapped. And the fact that it was bigger was both satisfying in the abstract way that a well-structured problem is satisfying and deeply unsettling in the concrete way that discovering you are standing inside a larger machine than you thought is unsettling when you are the only person inside it who knows what it is. She requested every arrest report Gallagher had filed in 3 years and spent 3 weeks cross-referencing them with hospital admission records. Civil suit filings, dismissed charges, and the IIA complaint logs that had gone nowhere. The pattern that emerged had the quality of something built deliberately over time by someone who understood how the paperwork worked and knew exactly how to make the numbers say what he needed them to say. 47 of Gallagher's arrests in 3 years had been cleared by Sergeant Mercer without a single query. A single request for clarification, a single follow-up on a complaint. 47 consecutive clearances signed in the same hand with the same absent efficiency, as if reviewing and clearing had become a single motion rather than 2 separate acts of judgment. Captain Odom's fingerprints were subtler and required more digging, but they were there in the timestamps of the IIA closures. 3 investigations opened. 3 closed within 48 hours, each closure signed by Odom himself with a notation reading, "Insufficient predicate for continued inquiry," a phrase so standardized and so empty that it had clearly been written without engagement with the specific facts of any of the 3 cases. And the poker game with Deputy Commissioner Holt was documented not just in the surveillance log, but in a series of expense reports Odom had filed over 18 months claiming gas mileage to an address that turned out to be Holt's personal residence, a detail so carelessly concealed that Raina wondered whether it had been concealed at all or whether Odom had simply never considered the possibility that anyone was looking. The surveillance began to shift in the 6th week. Gallagher started paying attention to her. It was gradual at first, a cruiser passing her building twice in a morning rather than once a pause at the corner that lasted a few seconds longer than traffic required. Then, less gradual, he parked across the street from her building on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in the cruiser for 25 minutes while Raina, watching through the edge of the window, kept her body angled away from the glass and her breathing steady. She went to the corner store. She jogged her usual route. She waved at Mr. Pritchard sitting on his stoop, reading the newspaper. She called Marcus that evening. "He's watching me," she said. "Has he run your cover?" "I don't know yet. Maybe." Or maybe I'm just a face he's noticed too many times, and he's doing what he does with faces that don't fit the pattern he's built for them. Do you need extraction? She thought about Calvin Morrow, whose arraignment was done and whose trial was scheduled for 6 weeks out, who was being represented by Vanessa Cole, fighting hard on thin evidence, because the only person who had actually seen the truth of what happened on Kramer and Fifth was someone Vanessa did not know was FBI. She thought about Mercer's 47 signatures. She thought about Odom's poker game and his 3 closed investigations. She thought about 89 pages of careful handwriting that she had promised herself would finally be read by someone with the authority to act on it. Not yet, she said. But the following morning, Benny Tillman called the cover phone with a code, a question about a car part, the part number corresponding to the highest urgency level, and she went to the auto shop that afternoon and stood at the counter discussing a serpentine belt. And Benny, not looking at her, said quietly, "He's been asking about you. Showed your photo around. Someone told him you've been taking pictures near the corner, and whoever told him it wasn't someone on street level. The way he was asking it felt like he already had the answer and was just looking for confirmation." She sat in her car 2 blocks from the shop with the heat running and the windows beginning to fog and thought carefully about what she knew. Someone with access to the original federal surveillance tip had gotten that information back to Gallagher. The speed of it suggested it was above Mercer. It suggested Odom had known from close to the beginning that federal interest was active in his precinct and had been watching in return. She called Dana. "I think Odom knows," she said. A pause. "How sure?" "Sure enough." Dana was quiet for a moment, with the quality of a supervisor calculating risk against value. "Whatever you have, we charge now. Gallagher on the Calvin Morrow evidence, Mercer on the paperwork Odom separately under obstruction." "Gallagher testifies in 3 weeks," Reyna said. "Every word he says under oath is a federal crime, stamped and permanent. Let him dig the hole in public. Then we walk in." Another pause longer. 3 weeks, and if you feel unsafe before then, "I'll call," she said. The evening of the day he stood outside Reyna's door, Brett Gallagher sat in the Millhaven precinct locker room after his shift and told Carl Briggs exactly what he thought was happening on Kramer Street, and the telling of it had the particular quality of a man who is more certain than he has any right to be, which was the quality that had defined most of Gallagher's professional life. "She's somebody's eyes," Gallagher said, unlacing his boot with the slow deliberateness of a man who is not in a hurry because he never has to be. "Some community organization, maybe. One of those non-profit watchdog groups that think they can film cops on their phones and post it on the internet, and that constitutes accountability." He said the last word with the flat contempt of someone who considers the concept a personal insult. "I've seen the type before. They move into the neighborhood, act like they belong, start keeping notes." Briggs was at the adjacent locker, not looking at him, his fingers picking at the Velcro on his vest. He had learned in 2 years working alongside Gallagher that Gallagher's observations required acknowledgement, but not engagement the way you acknowledged thunder without asking it questions. "She knows her rights," Gallagher continued, the second boot coming off. "That's the first tell. Regular people in that neighborhood, they hear routine check-in and they open the door. She gave me what specifically was reported at 7:30 in the morning, standing in her doorway like she'd been awake for hours. That's training. That's somebody who's been told what to say." He stood up, opened his locker, and looked at himself in the small rectangle of mirror he had taped to the inside of the door. He straightened his collar the way he always did, with the assurance of a man who liked what he saw there. "You know what the problem is with these people," he said. "They think documenting something means understanding it. They think because they wrote it down it becomes something real, something that matters. They've never been out there at 2 in the morning on Kramer Street when a corner goes wrong. They've never had to make a decision in 2 seconds that the department is going to review for 2 months. He closed the locker and leaned against it, arms crossed. The badge is the last honest thing left in this neighborhood, Carl. Everything else, the lawsuits, the complaints, the watchdog groups, moving into film, everything, all of it is negotiable. The badge isn't. Briggs nodded once the specific nod that meant I hear you and nothing more. I want to know who she's connected to, Gallagher said. I want to know who's funding her rent on Kramer Street because nobody moves into that apartment on a paralegal salary without help. And I want it handled quietly because if I flag it up to Odom right now, it becomes a thing, and it doesn't need to be a thing yet. He paused, looking at Briggs with the direct, specific look that Briggs had learned meant an instruction was coming. You have a contact at the city records office. Housing applications lease databases. Run the name Colin's first name, Maya No Carter, Raina Carter. See what comes back. Gallagher, Briggs said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite reluctance and not quite warning, but was the residue of both. If she's actually connected to something. If she's connected to something, I want to know before it becomes a problem, Gallagher said simply. That's how you stay ahead of problems, Carl. You find them before they find you. He picked up his gym bag and slung it over his shoulder. Besides, in 11 years in this neighborhood, not one complaint has ever made it to a courtroom that's stuck. Not one. You know why? He walked toward the locker room door, pausing with his hand on it. Because the badge is the last honest thing left in this neighborhood, and I intend to keep it that way. He pushed through the door and was gone, and Carl Briggs stood in the empty locker room with his vest in his hands and the particular cold feeling of a man who can see the edge of something but cannot stop walking toward it. And he stood there for a moment, and then he put the vest in his locker, and he wrote down the name Raina Carter on a small piece of paper, and he went to make a phone call. It was a Wednesday morning, 12 days before the trial, and Raina was already dressed and alert and fully inside her cover self when she heard the steps in the hallway, heavier than Mrs. Phelps, more deliberate than Jerome, carrying the particular authoritative rhythm of a man who is used to approaching doors and having them open, and she looked through the peephole and saw Brett Gallagher standing in the hallway in full uniform, with his hand resting on his belt, and Officer Carl Briggs half a step behind him, with his eyes on the floor. Her pulse jumped once hard the way a stone dropped into still water displaces the surface before it closes over. Then it settled. She took one breath. She opened the door. She leaned against the doorframe with her arms loose at her sides, the posture of a woman who has nothing to hide and is mildly inconvenienced to be interrupted before her second cup of coffee. She kept her face open, not warm, not guarded. Just present the way a person is present at 7:30 in the morning when they are tired and have a long day ahead. She watched Gallagher's left hand before he spoke. He tugged his left shirt cuff once quick, the unconscious habit she had catalogued across 14 months that tell he did not know. He had the small preparatory gesture he made before every fabrication, and she filed it the same way she had filed it every other time in the part of her mind where the record was being built. Miss Collins, he said. He said her name the way a man says a word he has been keeping in his mouth for a while testing it. That's me, she said. Routine check-in. He had the pleasant professional smile she had learned over 2 months to read, as the expression that preceded his least pleasant moments. We're following up on a complaint from the building. Suspected drug activity on this floor. She let a beat of silence pass. She registered everything in that silence. The smell of Mrs. Phelps's coffee through the gap in the apartment 2 doors down. The gray winter light through the hallway window at the end of the corridor. The tension in Briggs's jaw that told her the younger man was uncomfortable in a way that Gallagher simply was not, because whatever moral friction Briggs still experienced in these moments, Gallagher had long since worn smooth. I'm happy to answer any questions, Raina said pleasantly. But I'd like to know who filed the complaint and what specifically was reported before I invite anyone in. That information is part of an ongoing investigation. Then so is my door, she said with the same pleasant tone, and she did not move. Something shifted in Gallagher's expression, not quite recognition, but the thing adjacent to it, the recalibration of a man whose playbook accounts for compliance and for aggression, and who has just encountered a third response that the playbook doesn't cover. Most people, when Gallagher arrived at their door in uniform with that professional smile, did one of two things. They went immediately compliant, or they went immediately loud, and either response gave him what he needed to move the interaction in the direction he wanted. Raina had done neither. She had been reasonable and calm, and technically inside every right she possessed, and the combination of those things in the face of his authority was she could see in the slight tightening around his eyes something he did not know what to do with. He leaned slightly forward, dropping his voice. "Women like you always think knowing your rights makes you untouchable," he said. "It doesn't." She looked at him, and she did not blink, and she did not step back, and the expression on her face did not change by a fraction of anything. She understood in that moment that those 14 words were going to have a number assigned to them on a list that was growing longer every time Gallagher opened his mouth near her transmitter, and that saying them out loud to a device sewn into the waistband under her shirt was one of the more consequential mistakes Brett Gallagher had ever made. "We'll be in touch," he said, and turned away, and Briggs followed without looking at her, and she closed the door. She stood with her back against it and looked at the opposite wall and counted to 10. Not because she needed to calm down. She was not agitated, but because it was the protocol she had built for herself in moments like this, deliberately in advance for the moment when the unplanned thing happened and the automatic response needed to be right. Her hands were steady. The transmitter had captured every word. She called Marcus 15 minutes later, standing in the bathroom with the tap running. He listened to the recording on the secure line, and when it finished, he said, "He ran you. Your cover held, but he ran you. He knows something is wrong about you, even if he doesn't know what yet." "I know." "How long do you have?" "Days," she said. "Maybe a week. The trial is in 12 days. "I know," she said again. "I'm staying." The 11 days between Benny's warning and the morning of the trial were the longest 11 days of Raina Carter's adult life. And she means that in the specific, experienced way of a person who has spent considerable portions of her adult life in long, difficult situations and has a reliable measuring stick for them. Gallagher circled her the way a man circles something he suspects is electrified but hasn't yet decided to touch close enough to make the point far enough to maintain plausible distance. He drove past her building every day, sometimes twice, the cruiser slowing to a near stop in front of the entrance before continuing. On a Thursday, he stopped Jerome, the young man from down the hall who worked the early shift at the grocery distribution center, and had never done anything wrong in his life except live in this building, and held him on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, on the pretext of a vague suspicion about a bicycle that turned out to belong to Jerome's cousin, and then let him go without a citation or an explanation. The message was not the bicycle and was not Jerome. The message hung in the hallway that evening when Jerome came back upstairs and knocked on Raina's door, looking rattled and confused. "I can reach anyone you care about." "There is nothing you can do about it," Raina thanked. Jerome told him it was probably nothing, made sure he saw her being unbothered, and then closed her door and stood in the kitchen for a moment, feeling the weight of what it meant to know exactly why something happened and be unable to say so. She did not change her route. She did not change her hours. She jogged every morning at the same time on the same path past the same corner store where Mr. Okafor waved from the window. She visited Mr. Pritchard on his stoop 3 times in those 11 days because he was 89 pages into his journal and she wanted him to know that the pages mattered, and also because sitting with him on the stoop in the cold afternoon light, listening to him talk about the neighborhood the way it was before and the way it had become, was the thing that most reliably reminded her of why she was still in this apartment instead of extracted and safe. On the 9th night, she sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water. She was not drinking, and her personal journal open in front of her. Not the field log, the real one. The one she kept locked in the case with her badge, and she wrote for a long time. The entry ran to 3 pages, and the core of it was this: I am doing the thing I came here to do. I am doing it for Calvin Morrow, who walked home from church in his good coat and did nothing wrong. I am doing it for Tanya Morrow, who is 8 years old and needs her father to come home from work every day for the next 10 years so she knows what that looks like. I am doing it for Earl Pritchard, who has been writing the truth in a journal for 11 years and never stopped believing that truth written down is truth that exists even when no one is reading it yet. I am not afraid. This is what afraid looks like when you've decided that fear is information, not instruction. She closed the journal. She washed her face. She went to bed. And then on the morning of the 10th day at 2 o'clock in the morning, Gallagher made his final move. He called the precinct and filed a report stating that a confidential informant had identified a woman at her address possessing narcotics and a stolen firearm, and making verbal threats against a police officer. Briggs co-signed it within the hour. At 6:15 in the morning, 2 uniformed officers knocked on her door with a search warrant. She let them in. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands flat and visible on the surface, and watched them move through every room with the professional thoroughness of 2 officers who were genuinely looking, which told her they had not been briefed on what this was actually about. They searched the kitchen, the bedroom, the closet, the bathroom, the space under the sink, and they found absolutely nothing because there was nothing to find, because Raina Carter had been living inside a cover for 14 months, and the one thing she was most careful about was that the cover was clean. They left, and she closed the door behind them, and she stood in the kitchen for a long moment in the early morning quiet and felt the cold, specific clarity of someone watching a trap close around a man who does not yet understand that the trap is hers, and that it has been waiting for him for 14 months, and that the courtroom was where it was going to spring. The trial was in 4 days. The light on the morning of the trial was flat and white and winter-thin, the kind of light that makes everything look temporary, as if the world is a draft of something that hasn't been finalized yet. And Raina sat in her car in the parking structure 2 blocks from the courthouse at 7 in the morning and held the steering wheel with both hands and thought about nothing in particular for approximately 3 minutes. A practice she had developed over 8 years of this work. 3 minutes of intentional emptiness before she walked into something significant. Not meditation, not prayer, just the deliberate clearing of the instrument before you needed to use it. She called Marcus. He's going to take that stand in 2 hours and look at a jury of 12 people and tell them that Calvin Morrow had narcotics on his person when searched, she said. He's going to describe a lawful stop and a voluntary search and a legitimate discovery, and every single word of it is going to be a federal crime stamped onto the court record in permanent ink. And after, Marcus said. And after we walk in, she said, and every count he has just added to his own indictment comes with us. She walked to the courthouse as a civilian went in through the public entrance, cleared the metal detector, and took a seat in the 3rd row of the gallery, slightly left of center. Close enough to see his face clearly when his eyes swept the room, which she knew they would, because men like Gallagher always swept the room when they walked in, cataloging the audience, the way they cataloged everything quickly by category, looking for threats and finding none. She wore a charcoal blazer and no makeup, and her hair in its natural state, and under the jacket against her ribs the transmitter rested at its familiar cold weight. Not because she had been instructed to wear it today, but because 14 months of living inside this work had made the transmitter something like a habit, the way you reach for your keys even when you don't need them. She barely noticed it anymore. Gallagher walked in at 8:47, and she watched him the way she had been watching him for 14 months, from the angle that catalogs rather than responds, the angle that files rather than reacts. Pressed uniform, clean badge, the comfortable, slightly expansive bearing of a man who has done this many times and left every time with his narrative intact. He walked down the center aisle and took his seat near the prosecution table, accepted a cup of coffee from someone with the ease of a man entirely at home. Before he sat down, he tugged his left cuff. She noted it the way she had noted it every other time and filed it under the last entry in the column she had been building 14 entries now, the full catalog about to produce its final record. He didn't notice her until he was already on the stand and his eyes swept the gallery on the routine assessment she had predicted, and they passed over the first row and the second row and paused on the third row and came back to her face and held it for a moment, 2 seconds, 3, and something shifted behind his expression. The faint recalibration she had seen in the hallway of her apartment building 12 days ago. The slight unsettledness of a man who cannot identify why a particular face is wrong. Then he looked away, and the trial began, and she watched him prepare to lie. What Raina understood about the way Brett Gallagher lied was that he was very good at it, which was not the same as saying he was good at telling the truth. It was a specific skill, distinct and practiced, built over 11 years of standing in rooms where the institutional weight was behind him, and the incentive structure rewarded clean paperwork over accurate paperwork. He lied the way a person does something they have done so many times that the performance of it no longer registers as performance. It has become the story he actually tells himself, the version of events that lives in the place where the accurate version used to be. He described the stop on Kramer and Fifth with the fluency of a man narrating a film he has watched many times. A lawful stop based on observed suspicious behavior, Calvin Morrow moving in a manner inconsistent with innocent pedestrian movement, making what Gallagher described as furtive gestures toward his coat pockets, which constituted reasonable suspicion. A voluntary compliance with the request to submit to a pat-down, which Gallagher said Calvin had agreed to without objection. A legitimate discovery in the exterior left pocket of the coat, the color of the packaging, the approximate weight, the location relative to the pocket seam. He described it all with the confident specificity of someone describing something he had actually seen, which was what made him dangerous and what made him ultimately the author of his own destruction. He looked at the jury when he said it. He was good at that too, the sustained earnest eye contact of a man who believes what he is saying, or has made himself believe it. In the second row of the jury box, 2 black women were listening with the specific, contained attentiveness of people who have heard this kind of testimony before, and whose faces revealed nothing, because they had learned the way everyone learns something particular about their own safety, that revealing what you think of this testimony in a room like this is its own kind of exposure. Gallagher didn't waver. He was very, very good. Vanessa Cole stood for cross-examination and buttoned her jacket with the precise, unhurried motion of a woman who has been preparing for this for 3 months and is not in a hurry because she knows exactly what is inside the next 35 minutes. The impound inventory report. Vanessa produced it with the flat efficiency of someone pulling a card from a prepared hand. The report filed by the precinct's own intake officer on the night of Calvin's arrest documented the condition of his charcoal gray wool coat. The exterior left pocket, the pocket where Gallagher had testified the narcotics were found, had a broken seam along the lower edge documented at intake with a handwritten note and a measurement. The pocket could not close fully. It could not hold a sealed bag in the position and orientation Gallagher had described without the bag being visible from the exterior of the coat. Gallagher's neck began to color. Not his face, the face stayed controlled, but the neck, the particular mottled flush that Reyna had observed twice in the field when he was confronted with something he hadn't planned for creeping up above the collar of his pressed uniform. The timeline Vanessa produced Gallagher's own patrol log cross-referenced with the backup cruiser's dispatch record. Gallagher had testified that he was on Kramer and 5th at 2:17 p.m. His patrol log showed 2:12. The backup cruiser's dispatch record showed Briggs arriving at 2:19, which meant a 7-minute gap that Gallagher had not accounted for in his timeline and could not account for now without creating additional inconsistencies. The prosecutor's table had stopped engaging. The assistant prosecutor was studying her legal pad with the concentrated attention of someone who has decided that the best strategy available is to not be associated with what is happening in the witness box. Gallagher survived the cross. He held the line, adapted his language, fell back on imprecision where precision had failed him. He was experienced enough to know that surviving was itself a kind of victory. He emerged, still standing. But the jury had seen the flush on his neck and the patrol log and the broken seam, and those things were in the room now, and they were not going anywhere. Vanessa's final question came at the end of the 35th minute in the flat, uninflected tone she had been using throughout, as if it were simply the next item on a list. Officer Gallagher, are you aware of any federal investigation into your conduct during traffic stops in the Millhaven precinct? His attorney was on his feet before the question finished. Objection, Your Honor, relevance. Sustained, Judge Forsyth said. Ms. Cole, move on. But the question had landed. It had landed in the room and distributed itself through the air the way things do when they are said in a space where everyone is listening, and the jury had heard it, and the gallery had heard it, and Calvin Morrow sitting at the defense table in his charcoal gray coat. The same coat because Vanessa had told him to wear it because the coat was evidence had heard it. And Gallagher's eyes found Reyna in the gallery for the second time, and this time he held the look and she watched the calculation move behind his face. Who is she? Why is she here? Why doesn't she look afraid? And she watched it arrive at the decision that men like Gallagher arrive at when the world starts not making sense in the way they've arranged it. When in doubt, attack the anomaly. Gallagher turned to Judge Forsyth, and he did not ask for permission to speak, and he said it loud enough that there was no question about who could hear him. Your Honor, that woman in the gallery is a known associate of the defendant. She has been conducting surveillance on my officers for weeks, and I have a filed report documenting that she personally threatened a police officer. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the third row. Judge Forsyth peered over her reading glasses. Vanessa Cole turned from the defense table. The assistant prosecutor turned. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keys. In the jury box, 12 people looked at the woman in the charcoal blazer in the third row of the gallery. Reyna sat completely still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. Her face was exactly the face it had been for the previous 2 hours, attentive, neutral, present, the face of someone who is watching something and does not need to say anything about what they are watching because the watching itself is sufficient. She did not speak. She did not move. She did not react in any way that gave Gallagher what he needed from her, which was a response, because a response would have meant that he had the power to produce one, and she had been inside his orbit for 14 months, and had given him exactly as much power over her as she intended to, which was none. She did not move because at that precise moment the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Agent Marcus Webb came through first, followed by two agents in dark suits who moved with the specific, unhurried purposefulness of people who know exactly where they are going and why. And then behind them, ASAC, Dana Reyes, carrying a sealed federal envelope and wearing the expression of a person who has been building toward a moment for a long time and has arrived at it without fanfare because the work itself was the point and the arrival is simply the work completing itself. Marcus showed his credentials to the bailiff at the front of the room and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the high-ceilinged courtroom without being raised, "The United States Department of Justice requests to address the court." The silence that followed was the specific, complete silence of a room in which everyone's understanding of what is happening has just undergone a fundamental revision. It was the silence of 14 months of work arriving at the place where it had always been heading, and Raina sat in it and let it settle around her, and felt for the first time in those 14 months the particular quiet of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and can see the place where she is going to set it down. Dana approached the bench with the sealed envelope. Judge Forsythe broke the seal and read. Raina watched the judge's face move through the reading comprehension first, then something that was surprise, then something harder and very still, the expression of a jurist who has just understood the full dimensions of what has been occurring in her courtroom. She looked at Gallagher on the witness stand. She looked at Raina. She looked back at Dana. "Agent Carter," Judge Forsythe said, her voice precise and carrying, "is this accurate?" Raina stood. She reached into her inside jacket pocket and placed her badge case on the gallery rail, opened the gold shield catching the courtroom light. "Special Agent Raina Carter, FBI Public Corruption Unit," she said. "Yes, Your Honor, it is." The sound that moved through the courtroom was quieter than a gasp. It was the sound of air leaving a sealed space all at once, slowly, as if the room itself was exhaling something it had been holding in without knowing it. Gallagher was still on the witness stand. She watched it happen in real time, watched the color drain from his face in the specific sequence of shock that moves from the skin and works inward, watched the architecture of his certainty come down. Not all at once, but in stages. Load-bearing wall by load-bearing wall. Each one going, while the next one holds briefly, before it goes too, until what was left was a man gripping the edge of the witness box with both hands and staring at something that his understanding of the world had not prepared him for. His left hand moved toward his cuff. There was no cuff to tug. He had already been straightened as far as he could be straightened. His hand found the edge of the box instead, and gripped it, and he opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Raina faced him directly from the gallery, her badge on the rail, her voice the steadiest she had ever heard it in her own throat. "You testified under oath that I was a criminal associate of the defendant, and that you had a filed report documenting my criminal activity," she said. "That testimony is now count 17 of the federal indictment filed this morning against you, Officer Briggs Sergeant Mercer and Captain Frank Odom." A pause of exactly 1 second, measured and deliberate. "You wrote that count yourself." Gallagher's attorney grabbed his arm. Gallagher did not seem to feel it. His eyes were fixed on Raina with the hollow, collapsed expression of a building whose last supporting wall has been removed, and which is in this precise moment beginning to understand what falling looks like from the inside. Judge Forsythe ordered the courtroom secured before the murmur in the gallery could become something louder, and the bailiffs moved to both exits with the quiet efficiency of people who have been given a clear directive in a situation unusual enough that they are moving on instruction rather than habit. And the room settled into the particular charged stillness of a space where everyone is present and no one is going anywhere, and everyone understands that what is about to happen is not reversible. The jury was still in the box. Raina had discussed this with Dana 3 weeks earlier, the question of whether the arrest should happen before or after the jury was excused, and they had agreed that before was right, because the jury were 12 citizens of this city who had given their time and attention to a case built on a lie, and they had the right to see the lie corrected in the same room where it had been told. Marcus approached the witness stand with the measured pace of someone who is not in a hurry, because urgency would suggest uncertainty, and he was not uncertain. Gallagher watched him come the way a person watches something they cannot stop, and have just now understood they cannot stop. His hands still on the edge of the witness box, his attorney speaking quickly into his ear in a low, urgent voice that Gallagher did not appear to be processing. The handcuffs produced a sound that was small and precise, and carried the metallic double click of each ratchet engaging, and in the high-ceilinged courtroom, it was surprisingly loud, the way small sounds are loud in silences that have been stretched to their limit. Gallagher was walked from the witness stand. He was walked down the center of the courtroom past the jury box on his left and the gallery on his right, and Raina, standing at the gallery rail with her badge still on it, watched him come and then watched him pass. He was looking at the floor. She did not need him to look at her. The record was complete. But then he passed the defense table, and something made him look up, and what he looked up at was Calvin Morrow. Calvin was sitting in the second row of the gallery in his charcoal gray wool coat. The coat from the Sunday in January. The coat that had been documented and photographed and entered into evidence. And he was sitting completely still with his hands in his lap. And he was looking at Gallagher with an expression that was not anger and was not triumph, and was not any of the things a person might expect. It was something quieter and more durable than any of those things, the expression of a man who has had his word doubted for 4 months and is watching the truth correct itself in public finally in front of witnesses. Gallagher looked at him for exactly 1 second, and then he looked away, and the marshals continued walking him toward the side door, and the door opened and closed, and the sound it made closing was not loud, but everyone heard it. Briggs was arrested simultaneously in the precinct parking lot by a second team that had been in position since 7 that morning. According to Marcus's after-action report, Briggs said only 3 words when the handcuffs went on. "I know. Okay." The specific, exhausted acknowledgement of a man who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen for 2 years, and is in some part of himself. He would never admit to relieved that the waiting is over. Raina stood at the gallery rail for a moment after the side door closed, and then she unclipped her badge from the rail and held it in her palm and looked at it for a moment. The way she sometimes looked at the photograph of her father in the Kramer Street apartment, not sentimentally, but with the specific recognition of what a thing represents when it has been used for the purpose it was made for. She clipped it back to her jacket. She had a lot of paperwork ahead, and she was looking forward to every page of it. Sergeant Doug Mercer was arrested at his desk at 10:15 that morning, and he stood when the agents entered, and he put his hands behind his back with the quiet, defeated efficiency of a man who has been inside the institutional mechanics of this process long enough to know exactly how it proceeds. He did not protest. He did not demand to see the warrant. The only thing he said as they walked him through the operations floor past his colleagues' desks was quiet, and addressed to no one in particular. "I should have stopped signing. He was right. He should have. 47 consecutive clearances, 47 decisions to not ask the question that his job required him to ask, and the chain had held because he had let it hold, and now it was his chain too." Captain Frank Odom was arrested at his home 3 days later. 2 federal agents at the front door at 7:45 a.m. His wife in the bathrobe in the doorway, and when Odom read the warrant, his face went through the settling-in recognition of a man who has spent years believing his position made him untouchable, and who is now understanding, with the precision of a document in his own hands, that it did not. He said 3 times that there had been a mistake, and the agent who answered him each time said with the same flat courtesy that the warrant was valid and the process was going to proceed. His poker game with Deputy Commissioner Holt was canceled that week by text 4 words, "Not a good time." It was the last communication between the 2 men not reviewed by federal investigators. It never resumed. The jury that acquitted Calvin Morrow deliberated for 53 minutes. Rayna was in the courthouse corridor when the bailiff opened the courtroom doors and the gallery began to fill back in for the reading. She did not go back into the courtroom. She had been inside the story for 14 months, and the ending of it belonged to Calvin and to Vanessa and to Tanya, who was sitting in the gallery in a navy blue dress with her hair in 2 careful braids, because Vanessa had told Calvin's sister to bring her, because children should see the moments when the truth is confirmed in public, even if they are too young to understand the full dimensions of what they are seeing. She heard the "not guilty" from the corridor through the heavy wooden doors, and she stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and her arms loose at her sides and let that sound arrive and settle the way you let something settle when it has been a long time coming, and you need a moment to simply receive it without doing anything with it. Then she straightened up and walked outside. Vanessa Cole came out of the courthouse 15 minutes later in her good coat. Dark wool good buttons, the coat of a woman who takes courtrooms seriously with the bright, slightly raw look of someone who has just set down a very heavy bag. She stopped when she saw Rayna standing on the courthouse steps, and she looked at her for a long moment, putting together the last 14 months in new configuration. "You were there the whole time," Vanessa said. Not an accusation, just the statement of a woman arriving at the shape of something. "I was there the whole time," Rayna said. "I'm sorry about the limitations. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you more." A pause. Then, "Is he going to prison?" Just the 2 of them on the courthouse steps in the January cold, the city going about its business around them. "Yes. All 4 of them. All 4. Vanessa nodded once slowly with the weight of someone who has been fighting a long time and is for the first time in that fight putting something down rather than picking something up. Not triumphant triumph was not the right word for what Vanessa Cole looked like in that moment. She looked like someone who has been told that the thing she was fighting about was real, which was different from winning and was in some ways more significant because you can win an argument about something imaginary, but having the reality of something confirmed publicly and on the record in front of a judge, that was the thing Vanessa had needed. "Thank you," she said. Just that. It was enough. Rayna went back to her car. She sat in it for a few minutes without starting it, watching people come and going from the courthouse entrance, public defenders and prosecutors and ordinary people who had been subpoenaed, and ordinary people who were fighting for something, and ordinary people who had nothing to do with any of this and were just trying to get through a Tuesday in January. Calvin Morrow came out of the courthouse door and stopped at the top of the steps and stood in the cold air and looked up at the sky the way people sometimes look up when they have just been told they are free to go, like they need to confirm that the world is still arranged the way it was before. Then he put his hands in his coat pockets and walked down the steps toward the car where his sister had parked, where Tanya was in the back seat in her navy dress watching through the window. When Calvin reached the car, Tanya pressed both palms flat against the glass and her mouth moved, and even from across the street Rayna could read what she said. "Daddy." Calvin opened the door and his daughter threw herself at him, and he caught her with both arms the way fathers catch children who run at them without warning completely, without bracing, as if that is simply what arms are for. Rayna started the car. She had a great deal of paperwork ahead, and she was looking forward to every page of it. 8 months after the morning Marcus Webb walked into Judge Forsyth's courtroom with a sealed federal envelope, the case of the United States versus Brett Gallagher. Carl Briggs, Douglas Mercer, and Frank Odom convened in the federal courthouse downtown, in a room that smelled of floor wax and leather, and the specific, weighty scent of serious outcomes being decided in a space designed for exactly that purpose. Air-conditioned to 68 degrees mahogany panels on the walls. The federal seal behind the bench. A reminder that what happened in this room was not local, was not adjustable, was not subject to a poker game on a Friday night or a rubber stamp on a clearance form. The gallery was full every day. Not the theater full of a sensational trial, full in the quieter, more significant way of a community that has been waiting to be heard, and has arranged itself in the available chairs with the patience of people who have learned that justice, when it comes, does not announce itself, and requires you to be present and attentive. In the third row of the gallery, 6 people sat together who had never met before this trial began. People from different years and different blocks who shared one thing. Their names appeared in Brett Gallagher's arrest records in cases where the charges had been dismissed or where the arrests had been expunged, but whose lives had been disrupted in ways that expungement does not reverse. A woman whose son had missed 2 months of work during a trial that ended in a directed verdict. A man whose rental application had been denied because of a pending charge that was later thrown out. They did not speak much. They sat with the stillness of people who have waited for something to be true in public for a long time and are not going to look away from it now that it is. AUSA Gerald Park led the prosecution with the methodical, unshowy confidence of a federal attorney who understands that the evidence does the work, and his job is to present it clearly rather than dramatically. He did not begin with the surveillance footage. He began with Mr. Earl Pritchard. Earl Pritchard, 65 years old, in a pressed shirt and his good tie. Raina had called him the week before, and he had said he was ready. He had been waiting for this for a long time, took the stand and placed his hands flat on the railing, and spoke in the clear, steady voice of a man who has been telling the truth for 40 years, and has not lost the habit of it even when the room wasn't listening. He read from his journal. Not all of it. AUSA Park had selected 11 entries, one from each year of Gallagher's tenure on the Millhaven, beat each one specific and dated and written in the careful hand of a man who understood that the value of a record was its precision. He read them without drama, without editorial comment, without the performance of grievance, and the effect was more devastating than drama would have been, because the plainness of it made it impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. This was not a man saying he had been wronged. This was a man reading dates and names and badge numbers and physical descriptions with the patience of a witness who had been waiting for the court to be ready to hear him. The jury watched him read. Several of them were taking notes. Briggs testified next under his cooperation agreement, and the testimony he gave was the most significant of the trial in terms of operational detail. He described his role with the specific flat effect of a man who has had 8 months to sit with what he did and has arrived somewhere between remorse and acceptance that does not have a clean name. He described how it operated. Gallagher decided the outcome. Briggs wrote the paperwork that made the outcome look like procedure. Mercer cleared it without looking, and the arrest became official and hard to challenge once it existed in the form that Briggs had given it. Then AUSA Park played the audio. The courtroom was very quiet when Gallagher's own voice came through the speakers recorded on a January Sunday afternoon in Millhaven, clear and unhurried. The voice of a man who had no reason in that moment to believe anyone was listening. Write it up clean. Nobody checks the paperwork when the name is already familiar. Gallagher did not look up from the defense table when he heard it. He looked at the wood of the table and kept looking at it, and his left hand resting beside his legal pad moved slightly toward his cuff, and then stopped. Raina took the stand on the third day of testimony. Ausa Park asked her to describe the 14 months of the investigation. The methodology, the sources, the pattern of conduct she had documented, the chain of command she had traced. She answered each question with the same careful, specific language she had used in her field logs because the field logs were accurate and the accuracy was the point. He asked her to describe Gallagher's behavior in terms of what she had observed directly. She described it the way she had documented it, the stops, the searches, the plants she had witnessed with her own eyes, the false pretexts she had recorded the operation of it, the way the cruelty had become so woven into the daily routine that it no longer registered to the person performing it as cruelty, which was in some ways the most telling thing about the 11 years of it. "Agent Carter," Park said, standing at the center of the courtroom floor, "you spent 14 months living inside a cover in that neighborhood. You watched this happen to Mr. Morrow. You had evidence within weeks that could have ended Officer Gallagher's career. Why did you wait?" Raina had been asked versions of this question before by the Bureau's review board, by Dana, by herself at the kitchen table on Kramer Street at midnight with cold tea and a field log. She had thought about the answer a great deal, because Mr. Pritchard spent 11 years writing it down and no one read it, she said. Because the 3 civil suits before me were dismissed before discovery, and the complainants ran out of money or patience, and Gallagher kept going. I wasn't going to add to the list of attempts that didn't reach the chain. I needed the whole chain, and I needed it in a form that the chain itself could not close from the inside. She described at AUSA Park's request the habit she had observed in Gallagher over 14 months, the tug of the left shirt cuff before he lied. She had observed it 14 times across 14 months. She had documented it in her field log each time with the date and the context and what the lie was that followed. She listed them now one by one in the specific order she had observed them, and the jury listened to all 14, and the courtroom was very quiet. The jury looked at Gallagher's left hand. He became aware of it and pressed both hands flat against the defense table. Too late by 14 months. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and 20 minutes, which was longer than anyone had expected, and in the corridor outside the courtroom where Raina sat with Dana on one of the wooden benches that lined the marble walls, the time passed in the particular suspended way of time that you cannot speed up and cannot use and can only sit inside. Dana had brought 2 cups of coffee from the machine on the second floor. They were both cold before they were finished. "How are you?" Dana asked in the 4th hour. Raina thought about it. "Tired," she said. "The good kind." Dana nodded. She understood the good kind. When the note came from the jury room at 4:17 in the afternoon, the bailiff moved through the corridor with the alert efficiency of someone who has been waiting for something, and is relieved it has finally arrived, and the gallery began to reassemble itself with the quiet organization of people who know to get in quickly, because what is about to happen will not wait. The 6 people from the 3rd row found their seats. Raina sat behind them. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with the careful expression of someone who has taken the responsibility of the thing seriously and wants that to be apparent. On the count of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, we find the defendant, Brett Gallagher, guilty. In the 3rd row, one of the 6 people pressed both hands over her mouth. The woman next to her, whose son had missed 2 months of work, reached over and took her hand without looking because she was watching the foreman. On the count of evidence tampering, guilty. On the count of perjury, counts 1 through 16, guilty on all counts. On the count of perjury, count 17, testimony given in the trial of the State versus Calvin Morrow, in which the defendant identified Special Agent Raina Carter as a criminal associate and stated that he had filed a report documenting her criminal activity, guilty. The sound that moved through the gallery was not loud. It was the sound of 16 people exhaling at once, the specific release of breath that is the body's response to something it has been braced against for a long time being confirmed and completed. On the count of obstruction of justice, guilty. 22 counts, all guilty. The math of 11 years reduced to 22 words read in a flat voice in a room that smelled of floor wax and consequence. Gallagher was looking at the table. His attorney touched his arm. He did not respond. He was looking at the grain of the wood in the defense table as if the table were offering some alternative to the room he was sitting in, and if he looked at it long enough he might find the exit. Calvin Morrow was not in the gallery. He was at work. He had a daughter to feed and a basketball team to coach on Saturday morning and a mother to visit on Wednesday evenings. And the verdict in the federal trial of the man who had planted a sealed bag in his coat pocket on a Sunday in January was important and true. But it was not the center of his life, because his life had always had its own center, and Gallagher had only ever been a disruption of it. And disruptions, when they end, do not become the story. They become the thing that happened before the story continued. Raina thought that was exactly right. She thought Calvin Morrow had always understood something about this that she was still learning. The sentencing hearing was 3 months after the verdict in the same room, and the room felt different, not smaller, but more settled, the way a room feels when the contested part is over, and what remains is simply the weight of what has been decided being made official and permanent. Federal Judge Marcus Holt presided. He was a man who wore the bench with the particular dignity of someone who has been in that chair long enough to understand that his job is not to be impressive, but to be correct, and who had built a reputation over 23 years for being in the specific way that mattered in corruption cases both. He settled his glasses, looked down at the sentencing documents, and then looked up at the man standing before him. Gallagher stood to receive his sentence, and he did not look the way he had looked on the morning of Calvin Morrow's trial, pressed uniform, comfortable, bearing the easy authority of a man in his habitat. He had been in federal detention for 8 months, and 8 months in federal detention is a specific and thorough education in the distance between who you believed you were and who the world agrees you are without the badge and the uniform and the union lawyer in the next room. He was thinner. His skin was flat. The cuff of his sleeve hung loose at his wrist, and he did not tug it. He stood with the unsteady quality of a man whose center of gravity has been relocated somewhere he can't quite find. And when Judge Holt looked at him over his reading glasses for a long, silent moment before speaking, Gallagher did something he had probably not done in 11 years of standing in rooms where authority was supposed to flow toward him. He looked down at the floor. Judge Holt let the silence stretch until it had done its work. Then he spoke. "Brett Gallagher," he said. His voice was not theatrical. It did not need to be. "You were given a badge and a uniform and the trust of every person in the Mill Haven community. Over 11 years, you took that trust and you used it as a weapon. Not once, not in a moment of bad judgment or a split-second mistake. You used it 487 times against 487 people who had done nothing except live within the range of your authority." He paused, and the pause had the weight of 487 names none of them would ever know. You built a structure around yourself specifically designed to make sure those people would not be believed when they said so. You recruited partners who signed what they were told to sign. You cultivated protectors who closed investigations before they could become inconvenient. You made yourself in the geography of that neighborhood the last word on what was true. Gallagher's jaw was working slightly, not speaking. Just the small, involuntary motion of a man whose throat is trying to do something his mind won't allow. The law has a specific understanding of what it means when a person in authority turns that authority against the people it was designed to protect. Judge Holt continued. It is not merely a crime against individual victims, though it is certainly that. It is a crime against the idea that the law means what it says. Every time you planted evidence on an innocent person and walked away, you were telling that community that the law was whatever you decided it was that afternoon. And because you were never held to account for it, that community had no reason to believe otherwise. He looked out at the gallery, the 6 people in the 3rd row, the reporters along the wall, the faces of people who had driven from Millhaven to be in this room. Until today. He turned back to Gallagher. On the federal counts of deprivation of civil rights evidence, tampering, perjury across 17 counts and obstruction of justice, I sentence you to 19 years in federal prison with no eligibility for parole consideration before the completion of year 8. The sentence landed in the room clean and final. Your municipal pension is hereby fully forfeited. The pension funds will be liquidated and directed to the court-ordered restitution fund established for the benefit of the individuals wrongly processed under your operation over 11 years. The individual restitution amounts will be distributed to 7 named recipients. He read the names. 7 names, each one a year, each one a life. Calvin Morrow's name was last, and his settlement amount was the largest, and when Judge Holt read it, the number was specific and real, and the room received it in silence. Sergeant Mercer, 6 years eligible for early release after 4 in recognition of his cooperation. Officer Briggs, 3 years probation, permanently barred from law enforcement in any jurisdiction. Captain Frank Odom, 14 years, no early release. The man who had known the longest and done the most to ensure that the knowing never became consequence. The gavel came down. Once. Clean. Final. In the gallery, Rayna watched Gallagher turn to be led away, and for one moment crossing the space between the defense table and the side door. His eyes came up and found hers. She held the look for 2 seconds, 2 deliberate, measured seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she did not smile. She did not nod. She gave him nothing, except the same steady, watching attention she had given him for 14 months, the look of someone who has seen a thing clearly and documented it, and is simply at last done with it. Then she looked away. Not because she had to, because she was finished, and looking away first calmly and by choice was the most accurate summary of everything that had happened between them since a gray October Friday when she carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs on Kramer Street and set a photograph of her father on the windowsill and began to wait. The door closed behind Gallagher. The gavel's echo faded. The work was complete. Brett Gallagher was processed into the Federal Correctional Institution at Cumberland on a gray Tuesday morning in November through the same intake procedure he had administered to hundreds of other men across 11 years on the Millhaven, beat the property confiscation, the photograph against the white wall, the exchange of his clothes for the institution's the assignment of a number that replaced the name that had been for 11 years synonymous in a particular neighborhood with a particular kind of unchallenged power. The uniform he was given was orange and rough and smelled of industrial laundry, and it did not fit him well across the shoulders, which had been broad once from years of carrying the physical confidence of a man who was accustomed to occupying more space than he needed. The left cuff was too long. He didn't tug it. He was assigned to general population because protective custody was at capacity, a fact, not a decision, though the distinction mattered less than the consequence. Former law enforcement in general population occupies a specific position in the social structure of a federal correctional facility, a position that is not enviable and does not soften quickly because the people in those cells have long memories for badges and belt numbers and the specific kind of authority that had been turned against them, and some of those people had addresses in Millhaven and names in Gallagher's arrest record. The first morning he walked into the cafeteria with his tray shaking slightly in his hands, A man 2 tables over looked up from his food and said in a voice just loud enough, "Hey, Officer Gallagher, remember me?" Gallagher kept his eyes down. He had been doing that since Tuesday. The man's name was Darius, 19 years old, when Gallagher had reached into his own jacket pocket at a wheel well on Kramer Street and come out holding a package he held up the way you hold up something you have found, rather than something you have placed. That had been 4 years ago. Darius had done 18 months, lost his job at the distribution warehouse, lost his apartment, moved back to his mother's house, and started over. He was here now on a separate charge, a real one this time, and the specific patience in his face when he looked at Gallagher was not the patience of a man planning violence. It was the patience of a man who has been told that the universe keeps its own books, and who has just watched a ledger entry close. The first of every month for 19 years, no pension check would come. The account it was supposed to reach had been emptied by the liquidation order, and the house on Birch Street had been sold as part of the asset settlement to satisfy the restitution fund, and the life that the pension was supposed to sustain the life Brett Gallagher had built and maintained and protected with the specific, careful strategy of a man who was always thinking about what came after the uniform that life had been disassembled with the same precision and the same thoroughness that he had applied to 487 other lives across 11 years. He had 19 years to sit with that arithmetic. He had 19 years to think about a charcoal gray wool coat, pressed and dignified, and a man walking home from church and the specific weight of a package that had come from his own pocket. 6 months after the sentencing, the Millhaven precinct operated under interim leadership appointed by the city, a captain brought in from outside the district, selected through a civilian oversight process that had not existed before Raina's case and had been created specifically in response to it. Not as a tribute and not named after anyone, but as the plain, practical result of a city that had been shown publicly on a court record that was now permanent. What happens when there is no mechanism for the community to have a voice in who polices it? Mr. Earl Pritchard's journal, all 89 pages of it bound in a leather cover provided by the City Archives Department, was formally entered into the public record and displayed in a frame in the precinct lobby at eye level next to the front desk, where anyone who walked in could read the first entry. It was dated 11 years ago. It read, "Officer B. Gallagher, badge 3892, stopped Marcus W., age 22, at corner of Kramer and 5th. No citation issued, duration 18 minutes. Marcus appeared shaken when he came home. This is the second time this month." Not a trophy, a reminder. Pritchard had asked for exactly that when a USA Park consulted him about how he wanted his contribution acknowledged. "I just want people who walk in there to know that what they witness is worth writing down." Vanessa Cole argued her first case before the new captain's restructured department on a Wednesday in March and won in 2 days a wrongful detention involving a 20-year-old from 3 blocks off Kramer Street. The same case a year earlier would have taken 6 months and a directed verdict. She left a 3-word voicemail for Raina that afternoon. "It's working, thanks." Calvin Morrow was at the Fulton Street Community Center on a Saturday morning in April, same gym, same bad coffee from the machine by the door, same cluster of 8-year-olds who were considerably more interested in talking than in basketball, but who would one day be better players for having had someone patient enough to stand in the paint with them and not give up. Tanya was on the court in her blue pinny, driving toward the basket with the focused, slightly too serious expression of a child who has decided she is going to be excellent at this and is not interested in counter-arguments. A new patrol officer 2 months on the force, young enough that his uniform still looked like a costume, stopped by the wire glass window on his morning route and watched for a few minutes, And when Calvin glanced over and raised a hand, the officer raised a hand back and then continued on his route. That was all. It was not enough to fix everything. It was not meant to be. But it was different from what it had been, and the difference was real, and real differences accumulated over time become the conditions under which the next thing is possible. Raina moved out of the Kramer Street apartment on a Thursday in April, when the last of the snow was finally gone, and the light had the thin, tentative quality of early spring in a city that has been cold for a long time. And she took very little with her because she had always lived lightly in that apartment. In the way you live lightly in a place that was never meant to be permanent, but that had over 14 months become something she was going to think about for a long time. She left the key with Mr. Pritchard, who was sitting on his stoop when she carried the last box down. And he stood up when she came through the door, and he held both her hands in his without speaking, which was the right thing to do, because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and they both knew it. Mrs. Audrey Phelps was in the hallway when Raina came back up for her bag, and she pressed a small jar of dried herbs, rosemary and cedar, and something she had grown on the fire escape through a winter that had not asked her permission into Raina's hands. "For protection," she said. "I think I'm okay now," Raina said. Mrs. Phelps looked at her the way women look when they have lived long enough to know that protection is never finished, that the work keeps asking for it, that survival is not a destination but a condition that requires maintenance and intention, and someone who decides every morning to keep tending it. She had been growing things on a fire escape in a neighborhood that Brett Gallagher spent 11 years treating as his personal jurisdiction, and she had kept growing them anyway, and she knew something about what tending costs and what it gives back. "Keep it anyway," she said. Raina kept it. The jar went on her desk at the Baltimore field office, next to the photograph of her father, next to the printed copy of Calvin Morrow's acquittal record, next to the first page of Earl Pritchard's journal. A reproduction made at the archives office in the careful handwriting of a man who had decided that witnessed things mattered even when no one was reading. She kept these things on her desk because every morning when she came in and set down her coffee and opened the new file she needed to begin with the evidence that the machinery of justice could work when someone stayed inside it long enough to find the lever and pull, and because the beginning of the next case was better when she could see where the last one ended. Her father called the evening she flew into her new city, the new assignment already on Dana's desk. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," she said. "You did something good, didn't you?" She thought about Tanya Morrow pressing both palms flat against a car window, mouth moving daddy. She thought about 89 pages of handwriting in a leather-bound frame at eye level in a precinct lobby where anyone could read it. She thought about the sound of not guilty through heavy wooden doors on a January afternoon, and the specific quality of that silence in the hallway where she had been standing when it arrived. "I did something that needed doing," she said, a beat of silence, warm and full. "That's the same thing," he said. She held the phone a moment after the call ended, standing at the window of the new hotel room with the new city spread out below her in the winter dark full of streets she hadn't learned yet, and corners she hadn't watched yet, and people she didn't know yet, some of whom were going to need what she could do, and some of whom were going to try to stop her from doing it, and all of it waiting patient and real and necessary the way the next right thing always waits. The jar of herbs from Mrs. Phelps' fire escape was in her jacket pocket. She reached in and felt the small solid weight of it, the warmth of a thing that had survived a Baltimore winter through nothing more than stubbornness and a little light, and someone who kept tending it. She put the jar on the windowsill. She opened the new file. If this story moved you, if you believe that 14 months of patience, precision, and refusing to flinch is what justice actually looks like when it works, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a story like this one. Leave us a comment. Do you think Raina made the right call staying in that neighborhood all the way to the end? We read every single one. Thank you for watching. Stay with us.